All right, generous theology. This is Chuck, and I'm Brock, and we are here together as friends talking about the interesting text in this Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology. And Chuck, it's been a special text. You and I wanted to go through this systematic theology because we were excited that someone outside of our Reformed tradition had published a volume very much around one of these crown jewels of Reformed theology, which is this idea of this systematic theology. Now, more or less, a systematic theology has this idea that it's trying to group at a high level the fundamental topics associated with the Christian faith. And in our tradition in Reformed theology, there are particular loci, there are particular emphases and topics that are classically associated with exploring the Christian faith. And so you have, for example, the doctrine of God, you have the doctrine of Christ, you have discussions around soteriology, you have discussions around the doctrine of man or a theological anthropology. You have discussions around sacramental theology, discussions around church polity, and discussions around eschatology. There's just 6 or 7 major areas there. And so we were really hoping that this volume would really scratch that itch, of course, from the perspective with which it's offered, which is outside of our own. And Chuck, I don't think I can say whether this volume scratches the itch for someone in its intended audience, let's say, and I would say the intended audience would probably be a university setting, theologians who look to contemporary academics for their theological studies. I would also say this is largely a post-Barthian systematic theology, but we've just had a blast going through the chapters, the topics, the essays, 37 of them in this volume that are really about trying to organize in that fundamental way. Chuck, it's been enjoyable. We're quite close to finishing up our investigations here, and we're in the part 4, the section on prospects. And this is perhaps one of the most interesting sections, because here is where the editors of the systematic theology can make editorial decisions aimed at addendums or adding topics or adding things that they think would be relevant, that contemporary audiences bring to the task of theology. And so that's made this a very interesting section. Tonight, we have 2 areas to look at. One is comparative theology. That's chapter 36. And then chapter 37 is feminist theology. And both you and I discussed this earlier, and we both agreed that we probably weren't in a position to do these essays justice on their own terms, in terms of getting very deep into the material. But there was some high-level aspects of these topics that really were valuable and worth talking about. And so we're going to try to do that tonight. Chuck, when you think about that, the prospects section, the way that this editorial committee, this group of systematic theologians in this contemporary school made their editorial choices, made their decisions about what content, what themes, how to develop, how to organize, how to talk about method, all of these things. Chuck, what are some of your reflections at a high level of this volume as a whole?
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about this last week when we talked about liberation theology, and to some extent even leading up to that in the section on postmodern theology. But it is interesting, first of all, that this section exists. I'm glad that it does. It's good to read about, even though I don't know, I think in some ways to us who think of systematic theologies as really being about these loci, about these topics that are very theological, these chapters on maybe their own systems or their own ways of thinking through theology are a little bit outside what we would normally expect to see. But that said, it's good to learn about the way that people are looking at theology and the way they're doing theology, and getting a sense of some of the thinking that's going on there. So that part is good. But as we've previously noted, it does seem that given that there's only a few chapters that can be written, and you only have so much space to do this in, since it is not entirely a book about these various perspectives in theology. It is, interesting what was chosen for this section, and that, for the most part, other than the section on theologies of retrieval, we're primarily dealing with various and sundry extensions of the 19th century rationalist and project, or the 19th century romantic project, and some of the back and forth between those, some of that thinking, and as a result of that, there is a sense in which, for those of us who come from a little more of confessional, we would say orthodox way of doing theology, many of these newer ways of doing theology are not entirely comfortable to us, and we don't share necessarily all of the grounds for doing theology in that way. Now, that's not to say that there aren't things that we can't learn from them. And the chapter on comparative theology, I think, is at least interesting to think about, why might we do theological exchange? Why might we spend some time doing comparative theology? It might be different than many of the practitioners of that theology. But in fact, I think Father Clooney, Francis X. Clooney of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit, who writes this particular chapter, I think he does deal with at least some of those issues that may come up. And even points out that for those sort of more in the postmodern mode who don't believe that there is any, unifying truth, there are going to be attacks even from that side of thing on the very idea of doing comparative theology, since in many ways comparative theology is if not a Christian phenomenon, is at least a Judeo-Christian phenomenon, right? A phenomenon that is especially, people especially from Islam and Judaism and Christianity are especially engaging in it, because there are ways that you can do that sort of comparative theology rather simply among those three monotheistic religions. Whereas even just the idea of what religion is, there are going to be some differences when you get into whether it's traditional religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and Shinto and those kinds of things, or whether you start getting into animist religions, or even religions around that are more, in many ways more thought of as just simply worldviews or philosophies. It can be a little bit more difficult to do that comparative theology work. So that, that's an interesting conversation to have. But again, this chapter on comparative theology, as much as it was interesting to think about the dialogical nature of interreligious and comparative theology, in the end, I'm not sure. I'll be honest with you, as I re-look through this chapter and look at what I highlighted as being important, there are a few things, but it was not perhaps for me the most important chapter in all of this book. Now, maybe there's somebody who really loves comparative theology, and I apologize. Maybe you'll want to read that if you're really into that, or if you're really into thinking about how comparative theology might interact with confessional theology, and confessional doctrine. But yeah, in the end, I found this to be of somewhat lesser use than some of the other parts of this book.
Yeah, that's a great introduction here, Chuck. Thank you for that. I'll maybe throw out in a brief fashion what I would consider the good, the bad, and the ugly, to borrow a film title, associated with this chapter. And though I say the ugly, it's not meant disrespectfully, and it's not meant to disparage Professor Clooney and the essay that he wrote. Now, let's start with the good. Some things. First of all, the idea in a manageable scope of comparative theology as outlined in this essay is exciting to someone like me. And it might be exciting to someone like you in the sense that, well, Professor Clooney says the Christian tradition is no exception. Other religious traditions, too, have had to keep reshaping their self-understanding in light of their religious others. Intentionally or not, he says, interreligious exchange seems, on the whole, to have been a positive rather than negative phenomenon. So in terms of the good, I'm very much captivated by this idea of a marketplace of ideas. Allow Christianity a hearing in this marketplace. Allow it to be spoken about. Allow it to introduce ideas into the marketplace for people to consume. And Chuck, I have a thought that there will be great gain in terms of, I think, such a society where Christianity participates in this marketplace of cultural ideas is going to be a better place than a society where Christianity doesn't participate, as a generalization. So there are lots of reasons here for this. Now, in that sense, I really am sympathetic. Now, one aspect of this that would be concerning would be, what scope does the comparative theologian have in mind when assessing the truth of Christianity or the truth of any other religion? And I think one of the areas of concern for me would be this idea that, well, Chuck, I can imagine a Christian faith being strengthened in the marketplace of ideas where it has to compete against other ideas. And yet, what is it about the competition that is supposed to happen? And let me throw this out. My idea would in fact not be that Christianity should compete in the marketplace of ideas and then perhaps develop a competitive spirit as if trying to make itself more appealing or more useful or more utilitarian or advantageous for the society. I think instead it stands or falls on its own ontological and absolute truthfulness. And that would mean a fair hearing. That would mean the ideas being present in the culture. But I would be very concerned with a comparative theologian who would seek to make Christianity more palatable for the sake of competing in such a marketplace. Let's remove some doctrines here that cause offense. Let's remove some ideas or traits from the Christian faith that are going to be in conflict with the current spirit of the age. And then finally, I think a large concern with comparative theology is who's deciding, who's regulating this market. If we believe in an open exchange, in a marketplace of ideas, what we find when we actually look at how marketplaces work in practice is that there is a default set of understandings or cultural milieus or strategies for engagement. And there seems to be a danger that Christianity could just become one among many in the religion game. And so imagine, Chuck, you and I, we want to purchase a car. You know, we go to different dealers. I go to one dealer, you go to another dealer. We haggle with the salesperson. I try to find a great price. You try to find a great price. You try to get the best value you can for your trade-in. I try to find the best financing I can. And at the end of the day, in the quote unquote marketplace of ideas, maybe we come together and maybe I decide dealer A is going to be my choice and not dealer B. And then, of course, you're in a situation where you're doing the same thing. Well, what does it mean to be in that similar marketplace if you and I are shopping for religions, so to speak? You know, I could imagine the temptation that religions would face in such a marketplace. Chuck, imagine I go down the street to Buddhist Motors, for lack of a better word, and I start to haggle with the Buddhist salesperson. Well, okay, can I have this in if I become a Buddhist? Can I still be this way? Can I have that? Can I do the other thing? And what about this over here? And pretty soon I'm in this dialogue with the Buddhist priest or academic or whoever it is, but it's really much more of a sales game. And we're haggling over terms, for lack of a better word. And then I say to the Buddhist priest, well, thank you, Mr. Buddhist priest. I'm going to go down the street and talk to my friend at Hindu Motors, and I'm going to see what terms he offers. Okay, so I go down and I'm haggling with the gentleman at Hindu Motors. Okay, well, I want this religion. Well, okay, I see some issues that I'd be concerned with. Can I have some adjustments? Can I get the special packages? Can I go this way with that? Or am I constrained by this or that or the other thing? At some point, you realize that maybe such a marketplace is less about finding a true religion and much more about personal advantage, what the deal. What deal makes the best sense for me as a person seeking to be a part of a religion? And I think there's a grave danger there, because we see from our own understanding of Christianity that Christianity, traditionally understood, is not phenomenal. The human subject is not in the driver's seat, for lack of a better word, and nor should we be. And in fact, we're much more in a position of weakness. And so in that sense, the marketplace of ideas analogy can break down. And I'm not always sure that academics writing in the vein that the professor's writing here and that the other essayists are writing in, I'm not so sure that they get that. I could be wrong, of course, but ultimately this phenomenal approach seems to really be a very threatening approach to the integrity of a true religious quest, for lack of a better term. Chuck, there's some good and some bad there. I didn't get into the uglies yet, but I just wanted to throw it over to you to maybe reflect, respond to some of those points.
Sure. Yeah. As far as at least some of the good, I appreciated that there was an attempt, I think, by Clooney through how one might do comparative theology from the perspective of being confessional. And I guess that's not all that terribly surprising. When we think of confessional Christians, we're usually thinking of people like, Reformed folks or, some of the more confessional Lutherans. But realistically, even though the confessions are perhaps a little more diffuse and, there are more of them among Roman Catholics, I think it's fair to say that there is a confessionalism within Roman Catholicism. And for Father Clooney to be speaking from that perspective is not entirely surprising. And, he makes the point that while it may be useful to compare or to distinguish between comparative and confessional theologies, and so at certain times we're going to think differently about those different kinds of methods, they don't necessarily have to be formally divided as disciplines. And he says, we've entered an era where constructive confessional theology will ordinarily be comparative in its practice. And I think there's some truth to that. I think there's also some truth that it's been that way in the past as well. I was thinking about this a little bit. I run my church's Facebook page. And what I typically do on our Facebook page is once a week, I create all the posts for the week. They come out at 5 p.m. most days. On weekends, I have them come out a little earlier. But typically this year, what I've been doing is, on Mondays, we do a Monday music post. And so I take a hymn or a piece of music and talk a little bit about that. And then on Tuesday, and then going however long I need to go into the week, I've been taking sections of the Belgic Confession and, taking an article and maybe chopping it up into a few pieces, but posting sections from that particular article of the Belgic Confession, and then putting an appropriate piece of art with it. And so I've been spending this year, so far this year, I've been spending a significant amount of time with the Belgic Confession. And it is interesting to me that the Belgic Confession, as does the Heidelberg Catechism in some places, does some comparative work from a confessional perspective. We might not always feel as comfortable with the language that was used in the 16th century. We condemn the heresy of the Baptists, and maybe a lot of us have Anabaptist friends, and we don't want to call them heretics. But the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism both talk about how we have differences from the Catholic Church and differences, especially from the Anabaptists, as well as from other movements from that era. And the Belgic Confession really is one of the things that the Belgic Confession was really designed to do, was to say, yeah, okay, Roman Catholic leaders, there are some things we disagree with about you, but we're not crazy. We're not like those Anabaptists who go so far in the other direction. And so a lot of the Belgic Confession is about building a level of difference with Anabaptist ideas on things, and showing how there may be some differences with Catholicism, but that there are some areas where there is alignment as well. Well, that's a form of comparative theology in a confessional way. And I think probably in the 16th century, there was very much the need to do that kind of comparative theology from a confessional perspective. And it may well be that we need to do that today, because so many people whether they're Christians or whether they are merely Christian adjacent. And if you're living in North America, you are Christian adjacent if you're not Christian. You know lots of people who are Christians. And so there is a sense in which we may have to do some comparison. We may have to say things like, well, typically, most people live in this way that believes that, material, is a materialistic way of thinking, both as far as the utility of our bodies versus our souls, but also more in the way of what do we give importance to. And Christianity, well, we don't do that. But here's where we might align with someone who holds to these ideas about, the material body, and where we might agree and where we might disagree. I think those kinds of things, there can be a comparative theology done from a confessional perspective. So I appreciated that. Another thing I appreciated was actually on that same page 658, where he describes a little bit of some contemporary understandings of comparative theology from an essay by David Tracy in the Encyclopedia of Religion, and talking about the importance of dealing with today in recent years and having to deal with a pluralistic world, and that comparative theology as a discipline, as opposed to perhaps a worldview, as a discipline doing comparative theology can be very helpful in helping us to live our lives in a pluralistic world. And Tracy, as Clooney puts it, Tracy highlights some major moments in comparative theology. Now, some of these major moments we would have some concerns with, depending on how it's done. But he talks about, for example, reinterpreting central religious symbols in a religiously pluralistic world. And that could go in a number of different directions. It could be stripping, old meanings from those religious symbols. But it can also go to just things talking about how do people understand those symbols today, and how perhaps today's understanding of those symbols doesn't match up with the understanding that earlier writers gave to those symbols. And so there's a need to have a level of interpretation. I think here in our discussions, this is not modernism per se, but I talked a little bit about how, as a kid, I watched a movie put out by Christian Reformed World Missions about missionaries that the Christian Reformed Church had sent to the Sepik Iwam people in Papua New Guinea. And as they translated the Bible into the language of the Sepik Iwam people, they came to understand that for the Sepik Iwam, the stomach is really the center of the body. It's the seat of the emotions. It's the central organ in the way that the heart is for Western Christians. And so there is a sense in which the Bible translators who chose to use stomach instead of heart in the Sepik Iwam version of the Bible were doing a little bit of, is it comparative theology, or is it at least thinking about interpreting central religious symbols in a pluralistic situation? He also talks about providing theological interpretation with new foundations comprised of both tradition and contemporary pluralism. Basically saying we need to build on what we know. And since what we know today in contemporary times is this pluralistic society, we need to interpret understanding that those are the foundations that people have. Now, if we're knocking away the foundations of traditional theology and replacing them, that's a problem. But if instead what we're doing is understanding that people today are standing on different platforms, and so we may need to adjust how we speak, if not the actual meaning of the message, at least the how we give that message, that may be something that in a comparative theology endeavor may be helpful to do. He talks about addressing questions of religious pluralism on explicitly theological grounds. I think that's a good thing that we ought to be doing. And comparative theology can help us to do that because it allows us to understand what other religions are saying about things and what issues may come up when we talk about pluralism, religious pluralism in our society. And even thinking about how what may seem to us to be a strange ally when it comes to things like protecting religious freedom. There we may have some strange bedfellows. I think I maybe have mentioned here that one of the key cases when I was in law school was a case about a church. It was the Church of the Balu IA. I think there was another word in there, but an unusual religion that involved different certain types of practices that wouldn't match up with what Christians do, sacrifice of animals and things like that. But understanding that, protecting those kinds of rituals is a way of also ensuring that, and those rituals, which may be somewhat unpopular, is going to be a way of protecting religious freedom for Christians, as in some situations, some Christian practices may become rather unpopular. And then finally, reviewing tradition. He describes reviewing tradition by a hermeneutics of suspicion and critique, and by a hermeneutics of retrieval. And I think what he's saying there is that there is a sense in which comparative religion ought to give space to these theologies of retrieval, theologies that go back to the old orthodoxy, and in doing that come to certain conclusions, and allowing those to have a place in the marketplace of ideas, as you've put it. So those were some things that I appreciated. Now, as far as some things that I was a little bit concerned about, I think there is, to some extent, Clooney, perhaps at times to me, seems to be too trusting that engagement by more orthodox or confessional scholars in the practices of comparative theology, the methods of comparative theology, does not need to lead to more a perspective of comparative theology, that you can separate the practice from the from the tenets of certain types of comparative theology. I think that's a concern. It is I think again it is possible to do comparative theology from a confessional perspective, but we should not be naive and think that we can easily just do that and never have any concerns that in some way we'll start engaging in sort of this dialogical or dialectical practice of starting to move in a particular direction rather than using these other religions, these religions we're comparing, as a way actually to better understand our own views and to better and have a better apologetic for those views. He does say that the inevitably and permanently dialogical character of an interreligious and comparative theology does not mean that such a theology always eventuates in mutual agreement and understanding. That's a good thing to remember. And frankly, I can't disagree with what Father Clooney says there. And he goes on to say such a theology can remain confessional, even apologetic. The dialogue essential to an interreligious theology must be vital enough that it can become an argument in which differences are highlighted, accentuated, and debated. And even after comparison and during the give and take required by dialogical exchange, theologians should remain able to affirm the content of their faith as true, with a deepening sense of its intelligibility for those who believe it already. They should remain able to offer arguments in favor of the truth of their faith and to attempt to persuade their interlocutors. If some comparative theologians choose to be more or less confessional and apologetic than others, here too, comparative theology only demonstrates the same range of choices found in theology in general. There's nothing there I disagree with, but there does seem to be, frankly, I'm a little concerned that doesn't account for, this idea that inevitably, oftentimes what happens when we engage in these dialogical conversations, that there is a sense in which we enter into them, maybe not anticipating that we're going to eventuate in mutual agreement and understanding and in compromise, but sometimes that is what happens, and we have to pay attention to that. And so that's we're not to the ugly here yet either, and I'll let you move to the ugly if that's what you want to do. But that's those are some of the things that I picked up on that sort of align, I think, with some of the things you were saying.
That's well answered. I'm really caught between a rock and a hard place. There is more to be said about the comparative theology chapter, but frankly, in terms of moving through the material, I want to just jump over into chapter 37. Feminist Theology. This is an essay by Joy Ann McDougall. And the fundamental and underlying issue of whether or not a chapter on feminism ought to be a contribution to a modern, mature, systematic theology is really an open question. Now, there is much in the modern critique to agree with, and there's much that I would wish to not minimize. I think the issues have to come down to an analysis of what do feminists think is actually going on, and how, by contributing to this topic within the corpus of a systematic theology, how does that change the fundamental character and the principles upon which a true and vital religion is based? So we only have a cursory overview here because of time, but I think one of the things that I just want to focus on briefly is feminism really does seem to be captive to a particular ideological slant, let's say, and for lack of a better word, we will throw that out as an aggressive progressivism, and I might even make the association with socialist and Marxist thought. And so to the degree that that is an accurate diagnostic of what's really being brought in, I think we have to be very concerned about this. And I'll just give some ideas. One of the things that is talked about on page 672, feminists argued that modern theologians' root paradigm of sin as pride, what feminist Mary Gray later dubbed the Promethean paradigm of sin, hardly fits the lived experience of women. I'm going to say that key part there, hardly fits the lived experience of women. And so I think we're talking at a foundational basis of where do we look for fundamental truth. And we're going to see that this idea of this lived experience of women represents quite a distinct departure from traditional ways of thought. Now, while again, not throwing out all of the aspects of a feminist critique of traditionalism, one of the things that's most concerning here is this idea that we exalt one particular lived experience over another at this group level. And then on top of that, there are issues with who speaks for the group. So one contemporary example, in the United States culture today, it's very common for progressives to speak out, as it were, on behalf of disadvantaged communities. So think here of minorities, think here of women, think here of LGBT plus groups. And what typically happens is someone comes on the scene with outrage. Hi, Chuck. I'm outraged. I just noticed this imbalanced and unequal situation, and I'm outraged. Now, in a naive setting, maybe there's virtue there. But unfortunately, what has often happened in the culture is that outrage has become a tool of the market. And so if I go to the market and you go to the market and I use my outrage as an advantage over you, well, we see where that could go bad. And if I claim to be outraged on behalf of groups that I may or may not myself be a part of, or that those people in those groups may or may not have this universal shared experience that's associated with the point of contact, then we have a really difficult situation, ripe for abuse, also ripe for the introduction of what has been in the historical setting. When you look at, for example, the 19th century, the precepts of Marxism, that they are very atheistic. They're very not simply not only not Christian, but rather actively against Christianity. So an anti-Christian. So in that sense, feminism, to the degree that it has explicitly anti-Christian fundamentals, ought to be a concern. Now, the way that this manifests, we hear things in the essay. Christian sin talk itself has been complicit in women's gender captivity. Since the earliest beginnings of Christianity, the professor writes, theologians have explained the presence of sin in the world in terms of Eve's original disobedience and seduction by the serpent in the Garden of Eden. The tradition has held women disproportionately responsible for sin's damning history of effect, and also treated their bodies as suspect, as a source of sexual temptation. The basic outline of the early feminist critique of Christian sin talk stands today. Feminists had exposed the long-standing androcentrism that infected Christian discourse about sin in the West. And she closes the section. Christianity needs a different theological vocabulary if it is to speak in a life-giving way about sin. Now, Chuck, that's a very clear challenge. The new dictionary and the old dictionary are just not going to coexist here. And this is where we start to see the most concerning aspects of bringing in principles that are not only anti-Christian in terms of their origin and predisposition, but also importing this idea that we've got to throw out the theological dictionary. We've got to bring in the new language. And the new language comes with its own set of rules, with its own set of pronouns, with its own set of mores. And we're going to call this Christianity. Chuck, that's a big concern. Now, how did this essay strike you at a high level? What do you think of some of these fundamental principles, and what were some of the other points that really stuck out with you?
My largest critique of this chapter really was in that while it dealt with certain issues in feminist theology, it did so in a way that I think was so broad brush, overbroad, that it wasn't particularly helpful. There are reflections of additional complexity in talking about the different waves of feminism and the advent of newer feminist theology, womanist theology, for example, which comes primarily out of the African American community. But there is this sense that I think this chapter really is limited to a discussion of feminist theology and sin, one particular issue. And then in doing that, I think it doesn't entirely get at the whole issue. So you read a section, and that was the next part of after a paragraph in which Professor McDougall points out that there has been a sense previously of thinking of sin primarily as pride, right? And I think we know from studies that you and I, I'm sure, have done scripturally on sin and the meaning of sin, that there's much more to it than pride. But then, when we could be going in a direction that says, hey, look, what we've got here with feminist theology is an understanding that because of our diversity of voices that we have, because we have male and female, we often have not had female voices in the theological setting in the past, we may have a stronger view of what sin is, a broader view of what sin is. And then the chapter just moves on from that before curling back around, talking about re-envisioning a feminist theology of sin without really entering into, I felt, a real deep discussion of where this could go. Now, I'll grant, I think probably some of my reading is going to be a little different from yours. I certainly come from an egalitarian perspective. My own church is very much egalitarian in perspective, supportive of women's gifts as elders and pastors, et cetera. And I know that is a minority view among confessional Reformed folks. So I may read this a little bit differently, probably a little bit more friendly to some of these ideas. But it just struck me that, frankly, I had hoped that a chapter on feminist theology could actually get into some of the more orthodox feminist theologians and their view on things, and even more than that, just simply the contributions. Because we don't have a huge, or we may have some in the past, but we don't have very many women theologians in the past. And the fact that we do now have more, I think it could be of some benefit to us. But that's not really where Professor McDougall went with this chapter. I think, I'll have to admit that I think one of my favorite theologians who happens to be a woman is Fleming Rutledge, and she doesn't get mentioned once, in this chapter. And again, that maybe reflects, again, an assumption that feminist theology must only be coming from a particular direction. And that's not necessarily the case. We talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, I believe, when I mentioned I'm right now reading Esau McCaulley's book, Reading While Black. And Macaulay makes the point that there is a tendency among certain white liberal theologians to only put forward certain views of African American theologians and to marginalize others to fit their own perspective, to center their own sort of liberal white views on things. And to some extent, I feel like that's a little bit of what happened here as well, that what we have is, and I don't know anything about Professor McDougall other than her name. I didn't even today look up, where she's a professor at. I should probably have done that. But, it does seem to be, to me, to be just an assumption that feminist theology must only come from, one particular perspective without an understanding that there are plenty of Orthodox theologians who happen to be women and who bring different perspectives to the things that they're doing because of that. And yet, that seems to be not particularly taken into account. And one of the reasons I especially, feel bad about that is actually, I think there were a couple of chapters earlier in this book written by women authors who I think were quite good. I think, as I recall, Ellen Cherry, I liked her chapter on experience, and Rebecca Lyman, I forget what her chapter was on, but I thought that was one of the better chapters, and actually did bring about some of the more orthodox ideas on some of these things. And yet, unfortunately, here it seems like we're only willing to go into one particular direction, and I think that's a weakness. If we decide that we're only going to center voices from outside our own particular perspective only at such point as they agree with us, that can be problematic. And in fact, I think to some extent that's a little bit of what happened. What happened here. And yeah, I think I hate to be too critical, but in some ways I found this chapter to be a swing and a miss. And perhaps that's partly because I was really hoping for a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. Great points. Just one or two other aspects of the essay that really illustrated the extreme divergence being contemplated by including such a particular kind of feminism in theology. One of the sentences says, many of the pioneering second wave feminist theologians addressed the androcentrism of Christian sin talk by shifting the focus of the doctrine away from personal sin to the structural sin of gender oppression, to the structural sin, away from personal sin. That is a telling statement of an underlying anthropology. What is sin? It's going to be very difficult to make a case that sin is at a personal level when people see it only in light of this external structural sin. Now, later on, she says, sexism is first and foremost a structural sin, a systemic social evil based on a pre-existing system of male privilege and female subordination. There we have it, structural sin. And when we divorce sin from the persons who commit the sins, we really put ourselves in a situation where we question what exactly do we need a savior for? Oh, I get it. We need to be saved from these structural situations, but that's such a different focus from the deep anthropological need that's testified to in Christianity. Chuck, I don't need to be saved from what's out there. Reading the scriptures, I need to be saved from what I have become. And I think that gets lost here. Now, the professor says, in classical terms, Reuther argues that the original sin of sexism is both radical in nature and universal in scope. It is inescapable and all-encompassing in its distorting power. What do we see in this sentence? Well, we see an example of how the dictionary will be rewritten, how the vocabulary will be changed. The original sin of sexism and this focus on its distorting power. What a way to illustrate the temptations of this underlying Marxist way of thinking, in which everything is about power. For those feminists, she says, who anchor the problem of sin in sexism, redemption lies in liberating humankind from unjust pattern. We're back to the structural emphasis. The patriarchy is not a natural order, but rather a cultural production. It is a man-made reality that can be overturned. Women discover themselves as persons and experience liberating grace as the anger to break the chains of sexist socialization. Chuck, this is a big rewrite, and it seems a bridge too far. When I was talking with a dear friend of mine, this was 15 years ago now, who is a pagan, a Wiccan practitioner. One of the things that she said to me was, do you know what your problem is? Meaning your church. And Chuck, by the way, whenever somebody comes to you in a conversation and says, do you know what your problem is? that is a question that demands you listen, because it's coming out. And sure enough, here's what she had to say. You talk too much about sin. You're not teaching about domestic violence issues in the church. You're not holding sessions where your priests teach people how to balance their checkbook, how to have new life skills, how to become good at using computers, how to apply for social service, how, and the list went on. And Chuck, none of these things were particularly inappropriate things for people in the church to be aware of. But the fundamental issue is she had an idea of the church serving these structural inequalities. And there was no room in her view, in her vision, for the God of the scriptures. And that was devastating for me to realize. And that's a big concern here. When we're talking about importing all of these new things, it's very much we have to ask ourselves, at the expense of what? Now, if it's just about reducing injustice, eliminating issues where the church has historically had problems, boy, that's one thing. But rewriting the dictionary, reinterpreting theology through the lens of lived experience, and not just any and all lived experiences, these group identities, the idea that certain people can speak on behalf of those groups, and even sometimes members of those groups who disagree with that identity, that cultural ethos, can be considered out. And that's very troubling. I don't have easy answers here. And unfortunately, it's difficult to go through this in the time that we have. And so for that, I do regret that, we don't have not had the time to go in these further. But I think there are some fundamental irreconcilable differences at this point that has come up through these essays. Chuck, let me throw it over to you for some final thoughts and some analysis.
Yeah, and I think, well, I'm not sure that I fully resonate with some of the criticisms you've just provided. I do think that the weakness of this particular chapter is that it is so broadly written and primarily from a particular perspective that I think it opens itself up to the interpretations that you gave. Now, I personally don't have an issue with the idea of, that there is structural sin, and that structural sins, that sexism is one of those structural sins that we have to deal with, and that we do need to be saved from structural sins. I don't see them necessarily as outside things, but I think the weakness here is not really even talking about what's meant by structural sin. I see structural sin as a modern way of talking about original sin, right? There's original sin and there's actual sin. And original sin is that sin, of Adam and Eve that affects us regardless of the actions we take. And then actual sin, of course, are the actual sins that we commit as individuals. And I do think that there is a sense in which in the modern world we've become so individualistic that we don't deal well with structural issues. And that's been for the negative, I think. And Christians need to be dealing with these things and engaging with structural sins and how do we deal with structural sin. But not again thinking of it as something that's on the outside, but rather something that infiltrates all of us as original sin does. And so even though I don't resonate with your specific criticisms, I think your criticisms are a valid response to what I felt was a failure in this chapter to really deal with the particular issues in a fair and balanced way, and instead making the assumptions that, well, if this person's a feminist theology, they must be thinking in this particular direction, when it isn't necessarily the case. I think I have not yet found a book that does with feminist thought what I think Esau McCaulley does with African American thought, from a much more orthodox and confessional perspective. And I'm looking for that at some point to be done. I just haven't seen it yet, at least from a very theological perspective. But for folks who want to are interested in getting at, my concerns in that regard, I think reading Esau McCaulley's book, Reading While Black, will give you that perspective, on the concern that to some extent what we've done by only centering certain voices is stack the deck. And when we stack the deck, we stack the deck specifically with very modern or postmodern philosophies that are unwilling to engage with orthodox and confessional discussions of doctrine. That's for the worse and is a real problem. So again, that's to say that I understand why you have the criticisms that you do, and I think McDougall sort of opened herself up to that, even if I think she might were she here, she might say, well, that's not really what I meant, Brock. And she might be right about that. I don't know. And maybe she was purposely pushing it in that particular direction. I don't know. We can't have her on the show because neither of us knows her, unless you know her. I don't. But yeah, that I think that is a valid concern and gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is, why are these chapters here in this book, and why did they pick these particular ones? And that I think is of great concern to me, and why, as you and I have said last week when we talked about the previous chapter on liberation theology, this is a book that we might read with other people who are solid in their beliefs, but we wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't give this to my 15-year-olds. Most 15-year-olds wouldn't read it, but I actually have one or two 15-year-olds who might actually read this if I gave it to them, but I wouldn't give it to them because I don't think they're quite yet set in understanding all the truths of the gospel, and so aren't necessarily prepared to read through this yet.